Hello everyone, Ugodre here, and this is my money brief. On today's money brief, I want to talk about public debt. Why is Nigeria owing 150 trillion naira in public debt as at the first quarter of 2025? Maybe to be more specific, 149 trillion, 149.3 trillion naira. Approximately 150 trillion, or $97 billion if you want to convert it to dollars. Why are we owing that much? Let's break it down. So every country borrows. No big deal. Every country has a debt. And if you wanted to look at how huge a country's debt is, the World Bank or the IMF would always tell you to look at the country's debt to GDP ratio. So if your debt as a percentage of your GDP is really high, then you can be considered a highly indebted country. So Nigeria's GDP is roughly maybe $300 billion, right? And with our debt at about $97 billion, so we're doing a third or so of our GDP in terms of our debt to GDP numbers. Now, if you compare that to countries like, United Kingdom, Canada, US, or some of the G7 countries, they had debt to GDP ratios of close to 100%. Now, the World Bank also specifies that for countries that are very poor, like Nigeria, debt to GDP ratios above 50% can actually be a concern. So the fact that we're currently at 33-40% is slightly okay. But then there's another twist. They also tell you don't also look at debt to GDP ratio. You also look at your ability to repay that debt, which some people will call debt service to GDP ratio, or your income as a percentage of your debt service. So if you are spending more on debt service compared to your income, then that's a problem. At some point, we're spending 97% or so of Nigeria's income on servicing debt, which is really precarious because that, more than anything else, can lead to a default in debt. But these days, because we've taken our full subsidy and some of the reforms that we're seeing in the country, our debt service to revenue ratio has crashed to, some people will tell you, 50-60%. Still high, but it has dropped. But then why do countries borrow? Well, countries borrow because they have to spend on a lot of things in the economy, like social services. They got to provide roads, they got to provide healthcare, education, they got to fund government business, security, all sorts of things is what they spend. They basically borrow to spend. But why then do they borrow when they essentially collect taxes, right? Because that's how government makes money. Government makes money by collecting taxes from you and I. They also make money by also investing in the economy. So government can own companies or own entities, or like, for example, in Nigeria, the government owns NNPC or other entities that make money for it. The government can also be involved in exporting and can make money from exporting goods and services. So that's basically how government makes money. But a huge part of government's earnings would often come from taxes. And for Nigeria, most of the earnings come from crude oil taxes, or what we call petroleum profit taxes. We also make a lot of money from VAT, and make money from corporate taxes, while state governments make money from personal income taxes, which is the taxes that you and I pay as salaries. But sometimes these taxes is not just enough. It's not enough to cover government spending plan. And so when government earnings is way lower than government spending, it is called a government deficit or a fiscal deficit. Reverse is when government income is more than government spending, then that's called a fiscal surplus. So Nigeria has been running a fiscal deficit for over the last 10 years, 15 years actually, which means we've been spending more than we've been earning. And so we've been running a largely fiscal deficit budget in this country. Why? Well, because the government believes that it does need to invest in several things in the country. It needs to provide roads, it needs to provide healthcare, it needs to provide security for the country, it needs to pay salaries for civil servants. It needs to do several things. And so the income that is getting is not just enough to meet that expenses. And Nigeria is one of the lowest when it comes to tax to GDP ratio. Remember, I talked about debt to GDP ratio. So when it comes to tax to GDP ratio, Nigeria earns pretty less. Nigeria earns maybe 8 to 9% of its GDP as taxes, which is really small, because when you compare that to OECD countries, which are countries that are pretty rich, these guys do over 50, 60, some 70% of their revenue as a percentage of GDP in taxes alone. And so Nigeria has a long way to go when it comes to increasing its tax revenue. So because we can't seem to increase tax revenues, we do have to rely a lot on borrowing. But that is just one side of the story. There are other sides of the story as well, especially when it comes to Nigeria's public debt profile. Another reason why Nigeria's public debt is pretty high at 149 trillion today is also because the government tried as much as possible in the last 5 years to continue to run because of COVID-19. And so for that reason, the government was borrowing from the central bank through what is called ways and means. It was an anomaly. As much as there are provisions for borrowing from the central bank, because the government can borrow 5% of its previous year revenue from the central bank, provided that it pays it back. But we did see that breach happen over the last, during the Buhari administration. And ways and means hit over 26, 27 trillion naira at some point. And so that was debt that was also borrowed outside of the traditional means of borrowing, because you don't really borrow from CBN. And that debt was used to fund, government expenditures, state government salaries, federal government salaries. They all relied on that money to keep the economy going. And so that money essentially had to be repaid to the central bank. And what happened was, through legislation, they did convert that debt into a long-term bond that Nigeria has to pay the central bank every year. And that added significantly to our public debt figures. Now, the reason why our debt numbers also exploded was because we were carrying subsidy for years. So subsidy essentially is government basically paying for the difference between the market price of an item versus the cost price, right? So there's a huge difference between the market price and the selling price, I beg your pardon. So for example, for electricity, the market price for electricity was higher than what the companies in the power sector were actually charging. So that difference is a subsidy that the government was paying for. The one that you're probably more familiar with is fuel subsidy, because what it actually cost to sell fuel in Nigeria was way more than what they were charging in the filling stations. And so government was basically bearing that delta in fuel subsidy, and that piled up over years, and that ate into government revenue. And so how do you basically bridge that gap? It is through lending. And that is why you're seeing our debt levels at 149 trillion naira. But who are these guys that Nigeria is owing this much? Well, we go into the numbers. So Nigeria has different kind of debt. So you have domestic debt, and then you have external debt. So domestic debt is basically FGN bonds, which is debt that you give to the federal government through bonds. And you also have state government bonds as well. That is debt that is lent to the state government. So the state governments are the ones borrowing. And so based on the data we have, FGN bonds alone is about 59.7 trillion naira. And of course, this was also because of that ways and means that I talked about. So that sort of doubled this figure over years. So we're at 59.7 trillion naira with FGN bonds. So the good thing is that FGN bonds is in naira, and so the federal government can essentially print to pay that money. But they're not going to do that because that can also create inflation. So they pay that money from tax revenue that they get. Now, the second part of the domestic lending is Nigerian treasury bills. So Nigerian treasury bills is about 12.6 trillion. So that is actually a short-term debt, because it's a debt that is meant to be repaid within a 1 year period. But here's what happens. The government can often roll over this debt every year. So they can just keep that debt going year in, year out. So they can actually go for the next 10 years without borrowing fresh. So think about it. If the government borrows 1 trillion naira this year, all it needs to do is to borrow another 1 trillion naira next year to repay the 1 trillion naira is owing this year. And it can do this on and on and on and on. But we have also seen Treasury bills net increase over the last few years, but not that significant, at least by a lot of people's analysis. But Treasury bills is at 12.6 trillion naira. Now, states and the FCT just owe 3.8 trillion naira. So in total, most of the money that we owe in terms of local debt is actually divided into the FGN bonds and Treasury bills. And the total debt is 78.7 trillion naira in terms of domestic lending. That's the money that Nigeria is owing, outsiders. And so that's about 50% also of our total public debt. And so again, 59.7 of that money, 59.7 trillion of that money is to FGN bonds, and then you have 12.69 trillion to Treasury bills. Of course, you do have other things like Sukuk and FGN saving bonds, which combine it's about 8 trillion naira or thereabout. And then you also have promissory notes. That's significant lending as well, because that is the money that government is owing to contractors, and it's currently at 1.3 trillion naira. And of course, government owes contractors because contractors work for government all the time, and so that money is piled together and into promissory notes, which the government often services periodically, and is at 1.3 trillion. Now, the next set of lenders to the government is foreign investors, because they also lend to the Nigerian government, and we have them divided into multilateral foreign investors and bilateral foreign investors. So multilateral foreign investors are the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, because they are multilateral. That's what they call them. And so you also have the AFDB as multilateral foreign lenders to Nigeria. And the IMF, like we also say, Nigeria hardly borrows from IMF, but as at first quarter of this year, we were at $625 million. And I do understand that we have paid that debt off. So Nigeria no longer owes the IMF any money. Now, in terms of the World Bank, as at the first quarter of 2025, Nigeria is owing the World Bank $26.1 billion. There's another World Bank loan as well for reconstruction that Nigeria is also owing at $1.9 billion. So in total, we're owing the World Bank roughly $28 billion, about that. And that's what we're owing the World Bank, $28 trillion, I beg your pardon. So if you add that number together, that is about $17 billion. And to the IMF, it used to be $407 million, and we've paid that back already. Or 625 billion naira, which we've, like I said, we've also paid back. Now, the next set of lending is to the AFDB. So the AFDB, African Development Bank, as you know, Nigeria also owes about $3.7 billion. That is a multilateral loan as well. So the AFDB, Nigeria owns majority shares in the AFDB, one of the major shareholders of AFDB in Africa. And so it's also one of the major borrowers from the AFDB. And the AFDB, we are owing $3.79 billion. Now, Nigeria also has bilateral loans. So bilateral loans are loans to countries, between Nigeria and other countries. And one of our major lenders, bilateral lenders, is China. Nigeria owes China about $4.9 billion as of Q1 2025. We also own a host of other countries. We also owe, I beg your pardon, China. We actually owe China $5.5 billion, because it's $4.9 billion to the Exim Bank of China and $609 million to China Development Bank. So if you combine that, that gives you $5.5 billion. And of course, we also owe France, Japan, Germany, India as well. Interestingly, we don't owe the United States as a country. In terms of France, we owe France $135 million. We owe Japan $16 million. We owe India $106 million. And we owe Germany roughly $311 or so million. This is as at 2025 first quarter. Now, the next set of lending that we have that is also to foreign lenders is what we call commercial borrowing. So commercial borrowing are your typical Eurobonds. And in terms of Eurobonds, Nigeria owes $17.3 billion in Eurobonds. Now, another aspect of commercial paper is diaspora bonds, but Nigeria has paid off all these diaspora bonds, so which perhaps shows that we could actually tap into our diaspora community if we're looking for bonds. So diaspora bonds is mostly sold to Nigerians who are abroad who may want to lend money to Nigeria. But we don't have any diaspora bond at the moment. And then the last one is what you call your syndicated loan. And we only have one syndicated loan to the AFC, and that is $134 million. So that makes up Nigeria's entire public debt of $97.3 billion. So in terms of the foreign aspect of our debt, I could sum all that up here, and you would have a total foreign debt of roughly $45 or so billion in terms of total foreign debt that Nigeria currently owes foreign lenders. And so that in total is Nigeria's debt. Is this disturbing? Well, you might want to say it's disturbing because it's quite a huge number when you compare it to our ability to service this debt. But at the moment, it doesn't look like it poses any major danger because Nigeria has the capacity to pay this debt. Most of the debt is in local currency. As I already showed you, about half of the debt is in local currency, which makes it easier for us to service. A huge part of that debt as well is also from the likes of the World Bank and IMF. And so those are concessional lenders. And so their interest rate is typically low, and they do give you time to repay. Now, the Euro bonds, which is also a significant number, with, like I mentioned earlier, at $17.3 or so billion, is significant, but it is also well spaced. Some of it you don't have to repay till another 10 years. So you only just service that debt. So for that reason, it kind of looks like our ability to service our debt seems fair enough. But Nigeria still keeps borrowing. So which means we're going to keep borrowing way into the future because we're not collecting enough in taxes yet to meet our expenditure. And if you speak to government officials, they will tell you that Nigeria really needs to spend more because based on our population, we're spending less per capita compared to countries like South Africa or even Kenya. And so the government feels like we should be spending more so that we can provide more social amenities for Nigeria. But you got to be able to pay for that spending. And so that means Nigerians are in for a lot of tax headache over the next few years because the federal government, through the recently passed tax reform bill or tax reform act, are going to go after a lot of Nigerians who don't pay tax so that they can pay tax because they want the tax to GDP numbers to basically go up because they're not going to keep borrowing to get things done in the country. Rather, they need those taxes so that they can use it to pay down some of those loans. So expect to see a lot of taxes, especially if you have a business that is thriving or you're a high net worth Nigeria or you're somebody in middle class or at least between lower and upper middle class. Expect to see tax payments as one of those key things or one of those key headaches that you're going to have over the next few years because Nigeria does need to pay down some of this debt. So I hope that I've been able to explain public debt and why Nigeria owes this much on this Money Brief. Of course, until we do this again next time, do have a profitable day ahead. Bye.